Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Artists in Conversation. This event is in conjunction with the Fiber and Textile Art Exhibition Threads Laid Bare at Drake University's Anderson Gallery. I'm curator Emily Newman. Tonight I'll be introducing two artists who are included in the exhibition and let them converse with one another. The topics the artists will cover range from their individual processes and artwork, working with memory, and the challenges of working during this time of uncertainty. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Iowa Arts Council with funding from the National Endowment of the Arts for their support of this exhibition and its programming. I would also like to acknowledge that the land upon which the Anderson Gallery at Drake University sits is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, the Iowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Meskwaki Nation of the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi. I would also like to thank Lydia White, Anderson Gallery student worker, and Julia Franklin, Anderson Gallery manager, for their incredible support during this exhibition. I'd also like to say thank you to Sophia and Elena for their commitments to this exhibition and generosity of time. And lastly, thank you, our virtual viewers, for joining us this evening. My first artist I'm introducing is Sophia Rupert. She's a sculptor based in Lincoln, Nebraska. She received a BA in art history and a BFA in studio art sculpture from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. A recent MFA graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Sophia has shown nationally in exhibitions at the Salina Art Center in Kansas, the Virago in Contemporary Art and Adornment in Seattle, Washington, and the Lux Center for the Arts in Lincoln. Her work has been published in Fiber Arts Now, Friend of the Artist Volume 12, and the Woven Tale Press. She was awarded an artist in residence at the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts and will attend an artist residency at the Ragdale Foundation in Lake Forest, Illinois. Sophia is currently an instructor of record at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So good to have you here, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Emily. And thanks to everyone who has helped organize this exhibition and the discussion. It's a really fantastic show, and we're all very pleased to be in it. So I just want to start my talk with a quote by one of my favorite authors, Terry Tempest Williams. In her 2019 book, Erosion, Essays of Undoing, it's just been a really helpful book guiding my work the past year. And even though it only recently came out, I can see elements of this quote in my work prior to reading it. So the quote goes, "In the process of being broken open, worn down, and reshaped, an uncommon tranquility can follow. Our undoing is also our becoming." In my work, I look at physical and mental residue left behind by life. Some of life's lingering remnants are precious, such as memories and stories and heirlooms, while others are tragic, such as trauma or baggage. Regardless of this origin, this index of a life lived can be made beautiful. Residue of the materials and the objects that surround us chronicle our history as complex individuals. My sculptures investigate my own physical and mental residue to dissect and examine my personal history. I take a lot of my aesthetic decisions from two houses that I grew up in and around. The first is my maternal grandparents' neoclassical house. They were very proud of their image, and even though they definitely weren't wealthy, they were very good at putting on a facade of class through their taste and their belongings. Late in their life, their house started falling in around them. The second is my childhood home, which is where I get the aesthetic of collection or arrangements of junk. Most of the time, this house was arranged in a method to the madness sort of way, and there would be garbage next to antiques, next to tools. This obsessive collecting and hoarding still impacts the way I gather materials for my work. Despite being trashed, that house had delightfully gorgeous architectural moments as well. I've adopted this worn but beautiful aesthetic to convey the complexities and the underlying stories in my work. This piece is titled directly from the town I grew up in and draws visuals from both my parents' and my grandparents' homes. Each material I use is carefully considered and then manipulated. I select discarded materials that are worn and weathered, or that contain a rich visual association, so the core of my work contains an embedded but indirect history. In my collections, one can find a scrap of stained lace, fragments of a chandelier, and items that are completely unrecognizable. While rummaging through objects at a thrift store, I find that sometimes objects whisper and tell stories about their own past. I analyze these whispering objects and decide if they should be lovingly preserved or thoughtfully dissected and reshaped. The first method is of contemplative collection. The second is rebirth. Both methods draw out the stories embedded within. I explore experiences that are residually prominent in my memories. Primarily, I focus on events and objects that have shaped my perception of self. As a child of rural poverty, necessity was our driving force of imagination. We spent much of our time inventing toys and games to occupy our time on our grandparents' farm, where there was no TV and Wi-Fi didn't exist yet. The fragments of our memories are testimony of our personal descriptions. My work attempts to calm the dissonance of memory and share the resulting narrative. Ultimately, it describes self, history, and a personal theology in transformation. This theology allows me to create beauty in spite of trauma. Unlikely and contrasting pairs in my work speak to a dysfunctional family dynamic and a masculine violence shaping femininity. The more painful a memory is, the less I reveal in the piece. Other pieces, however, come with a very specific story that I'm happy to share. Sometimes the story is funny, quirky, or otherwise relevant. This piece is a direct response to a story told to me by my paternal grandmother, who was a very young child during the Great Depression. Even late into her life, she collected and saved frantically, never letting anything go to waste. This is the story she told me. She had just pulled up to the farmhouse in her truck. As she opened the door, the wind caught a loose plastic grocery bag from the cab of the truck and swept it high into the air and over a bean field nearby. She followed the bag to the edge of the field and watched it dance on the wind, amused at God for playing games at her. Because of her frantic need to save every object, she needed a way to get the bag back. In that moment, she prayed aloud and said, "God, if you wanted to bring this bag back to me, you could." Immediately, she claimed, another gust of wind swept the bag back to her, and the bag hit her right in the chest. She thanked God, clutched the bag, and went inside to stuff it into her stash of hundreds of other bags. I find this story amusing, ironic, and a little bit sad. The idea of testing a deity over the fate of a plastic grocery bag, the weight of the obsessive need to hoard plastic, and the plastic nature of faith compelled me to create these heavy, dancing, floating bags. When not frantically saving bags, that same grandma was worrying about any one of her dozens of grandchildren. She and my grandpa owned many acres of an abandoned rock quarry that was overgrown with trees, grass, and wildlife. As children, it was our sanctuary, and we spent countless days exploring the lakes, cliffs, and wooded ravines it had to offer us. One limestone cliff face was home to hundreds and hundreds of cliff swallows who would build nests right into the surface. I was mesmerized at birds disappearing into the tiny holes, and I imagined their nests within. No matter how high we climbed, the birds were safe from our curious explorations. That cliff was very tall, my guess is about 40 feet high, and my grandma was convinced that me or one of my cousins would climb too high and ultimately fall to our deaths. She rented a bulldozer and had the gorgeous cliff turned into an uninteresting hump of land. I was devastated at the loss of natural beauty, but I was more devastated by the eviction of swallows. Very often, my work is informed by the other. That other can be a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, or in this case, my partner. A life shared alongside another can be a tremendous joy, but it can also present challenges. In this piece, I took our bed pillows, indexically stained with sweat, and sewed them together with hair-colored thread. One pillow supports another gracefully, but also slumps under the weight of both. Last year, my partner wore through his go-to pair of pants. I have experience sewing and he does not, so he asked me to mend them for him. I took the pants into my studio and contemplated them for weeks. Although I'm typically happy to sew up our worn clothing, I just couldn't dismiss the thought that I was giving in to the patriarchal role of woman as domestic servant. In an act of defiance, I took a seam ripper and carefully and lovingly dissected the pants, preserving each piece, and I laid them out on an altar. It was an act of liberation, contemplation, but also of care. This piece is made from an old duvet cover from our bed. This bed dressing was used and washed for years and years until the threads, so worn from constant use and washing, started to tear with age. I sewed the duvet cover back up again and washed it, and it tore again in a different place. This textile was so fragile that it tore with even the slightest movements. The cover reacted to use by shredding itself, so I reacted to it by continuing what it wished to do. I have come to appreciate and even celebrate my humble beginnings in a rural Midwestern poverty where fishing was a necessity rather than a luxury. There were days when we relied on catching fish for our dinner. We would cast a line urgently and thoughtfully. Sometimes the hook would get caught in the reeds, and we would cry as a fuming father reeled us towards the snag to set the hook free. Titled, "What Have We Caught Today?" this piece explores tension, weight, grass, fish, and two harsh lectures. Through assemblage, we are able to create new realities. This piece is an apparatus that is ritualistic and mechanic. It plays with the combination of materials and absurd juxtapositions to lure us into a humble game to guess its function. The working class is appropriately named. Our labor was seemingly endless, and I often wonder what happens when we undo things. What does the act of undoing mean? With these baskets, unraveling strips them from functionality. Undoing frees them from continuing to bear their physical load. I am drawn to objects of rural labor. Typically, the tools I use are steel and contain traditionally masculine qualities. They also frequently embody an embedded action of violence. I attempt to soften these objects through manipulation and the addition of fibers. Repurposing these tools by stripping them of their original functionality and introducing a contrasting material releases them from their violent past and allows them to be tools for a different, more spiritual use. In this case, I use a jack stand, a drain snake, and a pitchfork to create a machine to aid in domestic tasks. The rusty apparatus weaves a rust-stained rug. Central to the preservation or dissection in my work are the metaphoric acts of sewing and weaving. These craft processes call back to the traditional idea that women are preservers who mend all that is broken. Rather than using the gendered practices for domestic purposes, I reclaim them to recontextualize my life. I mend what is torn, and I tear what needs to be free. By creating from destruction, I am piecing together a complex but beautiful history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Sophia. I feel like as someone who has been in a partnership for like 15 years now, I relate a lot with some of the things that you're talking about and some of the objects that you're willing and unwilling to sort of deal with. So I'm excited to, continue this conversation. But I'd like to introduce our next artist. This is Elena. Alanna Stapleton is an illustrator, textile artist, and educator based in Madison, Wisconsin. She received her MFA in Visual Studies with an emphasis in illustration from Minneapolis College of Art and Design. Elena has had recent exhibitions at the Textile Center in Minneapolis and Sioux Visual Arts Center. Her embroidery illustration has covered the front of Growler magazine, where she was also profiled as an artist, and she's been recognized by the Society of Illustrators in New York. Elena has been an artist in residence at the Light Gray Art Lab and Madison Public Library. She is currently an arts programming specialist for Wheelhouse Studios that's located on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's also a freelance illustrator. Welcome, Elena.
Thanks, Emily. That was a really nice introduction. And I just want to echo Sophia in saying thank you to everyone who's worked to put this together, both all these virtual talks and the exhibition itself. It's an honor to be a part of it. So as you said, I am an illustrator, a textile artist, an educator. That's a lot of titles. And I make a lot of work with lots of different tools for many different reasons and meant for a variety of audiences. I am pretty content with not being just one thing, even if I've struggled with how to define my work in the past. So much of my work, illustrative work, explores everyday processes. I'm interested in the connections between objects and memory and making the ordinary meaningful. I'm always looking to find the humor in the mundane. So this is an embroidered illustration made for a show called Artists in the Kitchen. It was an exhibition where 50 women artists and 50 women chefs and restaurateurs in the Twin Cities were paired up. And I was paired with Anne Rucker from Bogart's Donut Company. So this piece is a good example of the influence of comics and sequential narratives and how they have sort of shaped my sense of composition. I also illustrate a lot of food because preparing food and eating is a process we all have to engage with in some way. As someone that works with lots of different media, enjoys having my work exist in a variety of spaces, I've struggled with how to define it in the past. My practice has really stretched and grown and settled into itself in the past year and a half. I made this Venn diagram to try and help explain how I view all the different relationships between all the different things that I do. So I consider myself an illustrator. It's the core part of my practice. Drawing has always been my foundation and the thing I'll always return to. Hand embroidery lives mostly inside that illustration practice because I consider it just one way of completing an illustration. I like the urgency and shareability of working digitally and the tactile and tedious nature of working with embroidery thread. They occupy the same space for me, and I decide what to use based on the project and the timeline. Quilting is a more recent addition to this diagram. I learned to quilt as a young child, but this year quilting became one of my ways of surviving quarantine. My improv quilting practice is an offshoot of my illustration practice and love of making with needle and thread. The spontaneous nature of improv quilting provides an avenue for me to play with color and balance and shape without the normal sort of representational storytelling that I do through illustration. These experiments in turn are continuing to inform color and composition in my illustration work. So then education is kind of the last piece of this puzzle and really overlaps everything else for me. After finishing grad school and starting to teach a lot more, my love of depicting processes led me to really embrace that role as an educator and see it as an integral part of my practice and not something separate. So I'm enjoying exploring accessible creative practices, methods for creative play, and meditative-based making. So here is just a quick slide with some of examples of my digital illustrative work, plus a little travel sketchbook snapshot up at the top. Much of my work showcases bold colors and often hand lettering, while exploring, again, that humor found in everyday experiences. I think that in another life, I probably would have been a sociologist. I am deeply interested in the routine and minutia of humans and how we interact with the world around us. But because we're here to talk textiles, I'll share a bit more about my embroidered illustrations specifically. I get asked a lot how I started embroidering my illustrations. And I learned to sew as a child. So sitting at a sewing machine was a big part of my childhood. My grandma was a sewist, my mom sewed. my sister sews. This skill has really anchored me to the women in my family. But throughout my childhood, it was not a hobby that I chose. It wasn't a space I wanted to be in. As a member of 4-H, if anyone's familiar, it's a leadership and educational organization. I made a lot of clothes for myself that did not fit right, with fabrics that didn't feel good, from patterns that didn't feel like my style, even though I couldn't identify what my style was. So it wasn't something I enjoyed. But in my final year of undergrad, in a sort of upper level illustration class, I finally made that connection between I can draw and I can sew, which means that I can sew what I'm drawing. So it finally clicked together, and my voice really began to emerge from there. This piece in particular was pivotal to me for a few reasons. It was the first time I combined embroidered illustration with movement, which felt a bit like magic to me once I'd pieced the whole gift together. I had a grad school professor see it for the first time and just laugh out loud. It was the first time I realized that I might want to make work that made people laugh. Laughing out loud isn't sort of my main goal now, but I do love that moment when someone connects with the weirdness or oddity or humor of the thing that I'm illustrating. So humor kind of led me to this series all about things that are sharp. So these are two examples from that series. The one on the left is sharp nails. The one on the right is sharp words. I also illustrated sharp focus, sharp taste. So thinking all about those play on words and visual metaphors. This piece I made because I'm a big fan of autobiographical and memoir comics. It's in the same way that autobio and memoir comics are kind of curated diary or retelling. Hand embroidery is a carefully constructed record of the labor involved in the making process. So this piece is called Alternate Truisms. It was part stitched sketchbook page, part homage to Jenny Holzer's Truisms, which I love. In addition to a continued interest in documentation, this directly led to more hand-lettered embroidered work. So I don't really make work like this anymore, but I wanted to show because it really led me to other things. So sometimes the work that you make isn't about that like final product, and maybe it doesn't really fit into everything else you're always going to do, but it leads you to something else. So this led me directly to more hand-lettered work, like these two here. Hand embroidery is an incredible investment of time. I developed my hand embroidery style to mimic the look of vintage chain stitch embroidery machines. I use a split stitch, often used for like writing and line work. It's really good for curves, but I use it as a filler stitch to cover large areas. Using this style is a huge commitment to my subject matter, and to finish a piece, I have to build an intimate relationship with that subject and material. I'll talk a little bit about some of the pieces that are in the show. My Outlook series is what I call it. So to create these like travel inspired embroidered illustrations, I use a practice that I started about 6 years ago after I took a trip to Bermuda and I lost all of my photos and documentation when a phone update went wrong. So I combined Google Maps photos with what I could remember of where I'd been to do some little paintings to kind of process the trip. And now I use Google Map searches and sketchbook pages and iPhone photos and translate them all into stitched compositions. Memories are really malleable. Each time we access them, it's subject to change. I use that time stitching as an opportunity for meditation, time that's hard to find when you're traveling and taking in all kinds of new information. These pieces help me process an experience that seemed to go by too fast. This one, Cannon Beach Photobomb, is from a trip I took to Oregon. The last piece, I had pretty direct and clear reference photos to work from, including Google Maps. But sometimes the final piece is more of a crafted memory. The final composition is chosen to include details from several different moments instead of just one. And that's kind of more what this piece is about. I really did spend an afternoon at Cannon Beach with a friend, and she really did jump in front of my camera a few times. But it probably wasn't this exact view of the beach. It maybe wasn't this pose. This isn't a photo that I actually have. I wanted this augmented view, a phone view, to be featured because the impact of the phone snapshots have had such a huge part in creating all the pieces in this series. Since travel's on hold for the foreseeable future as we continue to deal with this global pandemic, these pieces have really taken on an added nostalgic significance. I find myself returning even more frequently to all the memories made on these trips. And the irony is not lost on me that these illustrations get to travel and adventure to new places, but I cannot. I'm also more recently reflecting on the role of truth in my work about memory and the relevance of truth in our world today, in American politics and society, in world politics and society. While I don't categorize my work as memoir specifically, I certainly am inspired by the genre and mine subject material from my everyday life. I'm working to construct images out of memories, stitching pieces of memory together into something new. I don't have a succinct conclusion to present to you, but I just wanted to mention that this is something I'm continuing to unpack and think about, and will probably continue to do so as long as I'm making work dealing with constructed memories. The work that I'm making today isn't what the me 5 years ago thought she'd be making. As I've gotten over any preconceived notions about who I should be as an artist, I've learned to follow my impulse to make wherever it wants to take me. This year, it's brought me to my sewing machine and cutting mat, feverishly solving whatever puzzle of color and shape that I've made for myself. With my illustrative work, context and intent come first, but with quilting, I make based on intuition and impulse. I use illustration as a means for communication, so I draw when I have something to say. Quilting doesn't occupy the same space for me. I still feel a need to make when I don't have any words or explanations, and I can make a quilt thinking only about color and shape and balance. It's a really meditative process for me, grounding me in my body and helping me to access what I'm really thinking and feeling. I've made a lot of quilts this year because there are a lot of things to think and feel. If I had to come up with a formula for the quilts I've been making, it's really about structure, having a framework, improvisation, and meditation. So not to go off on a totally other tangent, but I also make zines. A zine is a self-published, easily reproduced, printed form of self-expression. Zine history really intertwines with DIY, punk, and feminist underground cultures. Because I'm interested in process and accessibility, zines make a great format for me to illustrate short processes or explanations. I made this one-page zine about quilts this August, so if you're interested, you can download, print, and fold this zine for yourself. You can find it at the link that I've got on this slide. So it's my website, alannastapleton.com/downloadable-resources. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for sharing. Those are awesome. I think I already, when you posted on Instagram earlier this summer, I think I already got that zine downloaded. I was pretty excited about it. I am just starting my collection of zines, so I don't have a ton. So
I'm glad to share.
For some. Yeah, no, it's great. And also totally connect on losing things. When I was in grad school, I went to Greece for an art history course, and I lost all of my photos. And it was, thankfully at the time, I like spent every time we went to a site, I spent time like sketching I was so like engrossed in the brickwork. Like that was my thing. Like all of the different ways they could fit bricks together without mortar was like mind blowing to me. And so I sketched all of those. So I still had that. And that was kind of what I based my memories off of. So, and I'm going to say, and I don't know if you found this, but I feel like my memories are actually clearer when I sketch than if I were to just take a photo.
I think it's similar to like I still keep a written calendar. Like I don't love digital calendars, and I think it's that act of like writing the thing down that actually makes me remember. I don't often like reference my calendar. It's just that, oh, I've written it down and now it's there. And I think it's probably a similar sort of act is happening when you're sketching that thing. You like have to process it through a whole other like motion, and that makes it stick.
Yeah. Sophia's like this too.
Yeah, well, it makes a lot of sense because I mean, when you sketch something, you are shifting like the side of your brain that you're working on, you know, and it's sort of like a similar thing. Like if you study listening to a certain song or, you know, it's memory recall, and it's the side of the brain. It has a lot to do with it. I don't know like all of the science, but totally, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's why all professors say take handwritten notes, right? Because that's going to be way more effective than typing out your notes.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I've never related that to a sketchbook before. That's fascinating.
Yeah. You know, I am not like one for holding on to things from the past, like in that regard of like just doing it for tradition. So when the sort of like topic of they should teach cursive in public school comes up, I'm like, I understand why you wouldn't, but I also understand why you would, because there is a sort of like connection that you can make through learning a handwriting that is intended to be kind of quick, and like how that can connect to your learning. Anyway, I don't know. Anything that has to do with the hand, I'm all for. So I wanted to ask you guys a little bit more about memory, because I think that you guys, I'm sorry, I'm saying the Midwest, you guys, but you both deal with it in similar ways, but yet really different ways. And especially the memories maybe that you're sort of tapping into. And I was going to ask about like, because you deal with sort of an object that kind of gives, that kind of spurs a memory, and I'm going to use photographs as an object because I feel like they are. Have you ever worked with a memory or worked with an object? So it could be a photograph or a physical sort of three-dimensional object that has surprised you or become a challenge in a way that was surprising? And I'm going to leave that open. Maybe it's a process, or maybe it was a complexity that you didn't expect, or maybe the surprise was that the ease of it. I don't know.
Well, I have something in mind. Mine's kind of a story. It actually involves that same trip to Bermuda where I lost all of my photos. So that was a trip that I took with my roommates from college, and we took it after we graduated, and we were all not in a good place at the end of college. So it was probably the worst trip I've ever been on. Like, not the stuff we did, but like we were all really sad. And not communicating well with each other. Like we weren't being good friends to each other. So the trip was actually really hard. And I think that also contributed to like the pain of the loss of the photos too. So like I'd captured beautiful things and I'd captured nice moments, and all of a sudden I didn't even have that, even though it had been a really hard trip. So, and I didn't know how to tell my friends that like I was hurting, because they were also hurting in different ways. And one of the reasons I was really sad was because I graduated from college and I didn't have a job, and I was moving back in with my parents. And so, you know, after a few months of living with my parents, I wrote and drew this comic all about this trip and how I'd felt like I'd gone on this trip to connect with my friends and I just felt so far away from them. And it was surprising what happened after, because I shared it with them, not like an emotional letter that then I sent them. It was just, this is something I've made, and they also saw it, and it really kind of all helped us be able to say like, oh, that was hard for me too. I had no idea you were feeling that. And it, kind of brought things full circle. So a way of processing for me that really helped my friends process as well.
Yeah.
And get to understand me. So it all kind of came from losing a bunch of photos, because I didn't have anything. So I started Google Map searching and painting from places I remembered I'd been. So I think that was kind of the surprise that came from a trip that wasn't great.
That you had kind of maybe hoped would be like the greatest trip.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh, absolutely.
Like your eggs were like totally
planned it
in
that way.
basket. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel a real connection to trying to create from something that's not there anymore, because nothing that I'm working from is there anymore. It's all memory that wasn't captured in any way other outside of my memory. And a couple of things, Elena, that you said during your talk just really resonated with me. Like you said, that you make with intuition and impulse. And that's funny because that's usually how I start most of the things that I do, and I don't actually know. And so it's like a process of like discovering what I'm actually trying to get at. Most of the time when I go into something, I don't actually know what it is. And then you work and it comes up just straight kind of through your soul a little bit. And it just reveals itself. So that's the surprising thing. And usually when I have no idea what to do, I find it really hard to start with an intention. And so the intuition is just crucial. So yeah, those things, they reveal when they want to. So it's always surprising me.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, Sophia, too, like, I'm guessing you work with like the proxies of these objects, right? Like not the actual, some things with like your partner, like the duvet cover is the actual thing and the pants are the actual thing, but are the other, like the farm implements and the fishing poles, are those the actual objects, or are those like you found them and they just stand in as a proxy for your memory?
Yeah, those are all thrifted.
Okay.
I wish.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, that's a lot of pressure to deal with the thing that's the thing, right? Like, then it's like you really want it to work. And just like you said, when you really want something to work, it oftentimes just doesn't, right? Like, it's just not going to be, or it'll just look so contrived that it's worthless. So you're like, well, that was a fail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those objects, they could either be really precious, so you don't want to mess with them, or I feel like they could just bring too much baggage to the situation and just not work the same. And I struggled actually a lot letting the actual object go, because when I first started working with found object again, I started using things from my life. Like the pants was the first thing, I think in a really long time, several years, that I used or found object. So after using the pants, I'm like, well, that was sort of a breakthrough, and I have to find all these things from my life. And then I just went through my life, and I had just unfortunately Marie Kondo'd everything out of my life. So I didn't really have anything left. So I had to start thrifting.
But thankfully everybody else Marie Kondo'd. So then you were like, sweet, now I can do this.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. You talking about having a hard time letting go of some of these objects I forgot I was even making this work, but I used to make a lot of work about shoes because I had trouble getting rid of old shoes that I had worn to like significant places or events. And I was like, well, there's a record of that time on like the sole of those shoes. So I can't get rid of them, even though they were like totally unwearable. Or, it wasn't something that I didn't use them anymore, but it was really hard to get rid of them because I was like, oh, there's like a diary on the bottom of these shoes. I didn't write about that time, but I have this shoe. And it took me a while to get rid of them.
Yeah, I get that. I have a box that I've moved probably since I was in undergrad that's just labeled sentimental clothing. It's just like things that I won't wear, but it's also things that I'm like holding on to for some reason. That's like, okay. And every once in a while I look at it. It's sort of like a photo album, I suppose, in a way, you know, as a way of conjuring memory. But yeah. Objects are crazy the way they can hold that stuff. So then you guys are talking a lot about intuition. So can you go into a little bit more of your process? Like I don't want to say like, what's your day like? Because I feel like I know it's going to be so different, but like, I don't know, how best can you describe your process for someone who may not know?
So mine is shifting a little bit at the moment. It used to be I started at the sewing machine with Lycra, really stretchy fabric, and sewed up forms that reminded me of the thing I was thinking about. Like one time I tried to sew a nose, and then I just filled it with plaster, and then it turned into not a nose, because you can't predict what the plaster is going to do. And I made a lot of things that way. That's how the plastic bags started. And I didn't want to throw any scraps away, probably because of who my grandma was and how she lived her life. But I just had these little tiny scraps of white. And so I made the tiniest little plaster forms that I could, and then just, saw it immediately. So typically I just, whatever's there, I pick up and I just start to work with it. Recently, since it has been so object-based, I start at the store and I just walk through and with no intention at all, and just look at every object and just try to give everything an equal opportunity and collect. I do a lot of collecting. And so I just take all those things into my studio and start putting things together, unlikely combinations, and seeing what things do, asking them what they want to do, or asking them like who they want to be friends with in the studio. Typically, a lot of metal, a lot of fibers are going together right now, and then it just sort of, I don't know. It doesn't really. There's like a magic moment where it just like sort of comes together. I can't really explain that, but that's my process right now.
Yeah, well, I can describe mine a little bit. Mine has also changed, I think, a lot because of the quilts I've started to make this year that are really guided by that sort of active impulse and intuition. Usually when I'm sort of starting an illustration, the sketchbooks I do keep are actually kind of more words than drawings. So I'm often kind of like thinking about an idea or a phrase or something that like I can't let go of. And that's where a drawing might start from. But with these quilts, I was anxious or, sad or whatever in this time. And I needed something to do with my hands. And so it was really just about like cutting fabric and sewing it together and seeing what happened. So it was like, okay, I've made one act. Now I have to build off the next act. And now I have to build off of that, and just kind of adapting as it went. I do sort of start out with like limited color palettes. Like I'll pick out, these 6 fabrics I'm going to work with. And then I build the whole quilt around those 6 fabrics. And that's definitely how I illustrate as well, working with those like limited color palettes, giving myself a little bit of framework and then going wild within that. But I think the intuition or the impulse making and the intuition based kind of guidance I've had in these quilts has kind of loosened me up when it comes to my illustrations as well. So I'm already seeing it kind of work full circle with that, which is exciting. Instead of being so like, okay, I have a plan and I know what's going to happen next and I know how this is going to look. Now that like those quilts are really informing this other kind of thought, which is exciting. Also, like I will work on a quilt and I might not like how it turns out, and then I'll walk away from it and I'll come back and I'll flip it upside down and I'll be like, oh, that's it. Like that's how it should look. Yeah. And then it's finished like that, which is always surprising and has been really fun.
Yeah. We do that a lot in my classes. I'm like, turn it upside down. And they're like, oh yeah, that looks better. And I'm like, yeah, there you go. So I was going to ask, since I think it's a good segue in terms of your quilting was brought forward through the craziness that has been the pandemic specifically. But I was wondering about how you guys work, because you both deal with memories that are maybe really specific to you. I also wanted to ask you how you sort of deal, or how you maybe are dealing now, maybe it wasn't something you had to really consider, about sort of the challenges of uncertainty. Like how does your practice or your process allow you to reflect or respond to, the ongoing events that are happening, like everything from the pandemic, which certainly is taking a forefront, but back this summer, all of the racial injustice that's happening, it's continuing to happen, but also the protests that were sort of starting up in every single city. I know both Minneapolis and Lincoln and probably Madison and Des Moines all had major protests. The political climate, the ongoing environmental crisis, like how are you dealing with those things, or do you deal with those in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I guess I make with the notion of like the personal being political in mind. So just the simple act of like telling a personal story is an act of, standing up for what you believe in. I think that is reflected in maybe the like freelance jobs I decide to take, making sure that like the stories I'm telling there are responsible, or are maybe making sure that I'm the person who's supposed to be telling that story, or if I don't feel like I am, that I'm passing it on to somebody else, or that I'm redistributing funds to mutual aid organizations where I live. All of those kinds of things I think play into what's happening. And even if my work, like subject matter wise, maybe isn't about politics or racial equity, it still plays out in like the way I navigate the world. Or I make a lot of work about myself, but if it's not specifically about me, making sure that I'm also depicting bodies of all types. So thinking about different sizes, thinking about different abilities, thinking about different colors and cultural traditions, because like I don't want white to be the default in my illustrations, especially if it's not a thing that's like about a specific memory to me. So that's something I'm really has been at the forefront of what I'm trying to remember to do as well. And working with textiles, there's so much like political and activist history attached to hand embroidering and quilting and all of that. So that history is like carried with me as I make. And like, that's something I'm always thinking about too, even if the end result isn't specifically a part of the subject matter. I think that history is always carried with you.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah, it's hard to escape fibers it's hard to separate fibers from politics.
Totally.
I guess in my work, since I just completed my MFA and I've just been like in student mode for 9 years, and that's post high school. So really intense studio practices for almost a decade. Honestly, I haven't been making a lot. And I'm a big believer in rest, especially when things are in transition. I'm not like the type of person that I can't just like work through every problem, especially now with my studio. I just moved my studio and it's now in a warehouse with lots of people who, don't wear masks, and I don't necessarily feel safe going in there. And there's so many things, and I feel like I'm at a crossroads right now. So I feel like I kind of have said almost, I can keep exploring like my own life for as long as I want. But then, I keep thinking outside of myself. And there's so many things that need to be discussed. And I can't stop thinking about the environment. Like it's really at the forefront of my mind right now, because we're sort of at that stage where, you know, pretty soon there'll be no going back. And then with the pandemic, like there's so many things that I'm thinking about with that, like loaded politically. And then with the sort of awakening and discussion that we're having nationally about race and about whiteness, it's things you can't escape it, and I don't want to. And I'm doing a lot of reflecting and a lot of listening and a lot of learning, and I haven't really made that outward push from my work. And in fact, I'm applying to residencies, and that's in my letters. I'm always like, I need to start to look outside of myself and make this work relevant to a broader audience. And so that's something that I haven't resolved, but I'm always thinking about how you can make a comment about something that is that you have very little like knowledge about and experience in. And I'm always thinking like, whose business is it, and you know, whose voice are you either amplifying or trampling by bringing any sort of awareness to a situation. And I always think about white people making comments on the issue of racial justice, and it's a really sensitive thing to do. I don't think it's a reason to not do it. I haven't figured out how to do it in my work yet, but I'm always looking to the work of Jane Alexander, who is an artist in her piece, The Butcher Boys. If you guys aren't aware of that piece, it's 3 life-sized figures with really like pale skin, with sort of like demon horns and like blacked out eyes, and they're just sitting very casually on this bus bench. And this is in South Africa post-apartheid, and just showing like, you know, that silence is violence and complacency is violence, and so that's when I think about making a comment about that, I'm always going back to that, and if that were to come into my work, it would definitely be through the lens of white violence. But there's so many things and so many layers, and it's just like this question that is way larger than my understanding right now.
I think you bring up a really good point about you don't have an answer, but you can make work about like the questions that you're asking, rather than like, oh, this is what I figured out. And I think that's something
the solution, the artist doesn't have to offer the solution, right?
Yeah, but our art doesn't have to be about the answer to everything, which can be hard. Sometimes you don't want to approach, or you don't want to say anything if you don't know exactly what you're talking about. But I think making work about the questions that you're asking can be just as exciting and important.
Yeah. Well, actually, so this question from a viewer, I think kind of actually goes along with what you're talking about, you know, like how much do you give the viewer of yourself, or if you're dealing with a different group. So Rocio says, do you ever feel the need to explain the meaning behind what you have made so that others understand, or do you leave it up to them to interpret? And I suppose this is actually a really great question, because you kind of, both of you have different, you're using different forms of communication. Illustration by its nature is very different than, say, a, you know, sculpture. So.
Yeah, I guess as an illustrator, that communication is just such a central role to the reason that I'm making, that if I have to explain it, then I haven't done a good job making that image. Like, then it's maybe not in the right place and needs to find a new context to do a better job, or you need to make a new image. So I think that is sometimes, if I do feel like I need to explain it, it's sometimes maybe a failure of what I've done, and I have to rethink how I've approached that. But then in other aspects, you know, maybe if I'm making more like personal work or my quilts, it's just like, here's what it is. You can see whatever you want to see in it. And I feel less of a responsibility to have something to say through that. So I guess that's how I approach that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I'm so happy to share a story if a specific piece has a story like that's meaningful or can enhance. But this is something that I've been talking to a lot of mentors and peers about, when the story can get in the way of a viewer's relationship with the piece. And so I try to title pieces in a way where it can sort of lead you on a path for your own understanding, but especially to make it, I think work can get weighed down with a story, and so it's sort of a fine line that I'm dancing right now. Like when in my talk, I got very detailed about a couple of stories, and left a couple of other things, just sort of moments or gestures or feelings, because sometimes the words don't matter as much to me. So.
Right. Well, and I think with both illustration and, for instance, like a narrative sculpture that you're kind of talking about, I think that you need to have that accessibility that people can enter, right? So if you give too much information, people can't connect. But when you're talking about the right image, Elena, you're talking about, a lot of the work that I'm seeing out of you has things that people connect with because it's part of our daily lives, like cell phones. Like it's something that we all have, that the majority of us have, and we're going to connect with that image because we've been there. Whereas, Sophia, in terms of your bags, while you connected with this really specific story and shared that, for me, I think back to various times when I was stuffing things like stockings, nylon stockings, with other materials through sculpture, and sort of that playing with physicality and weight and, gravity and things like that. So, and space. And so, and I'm sure other people are going to enter with their own life experiences of dealing with these overloaded bags, whether that was a memory of a sandwich exploding on a bus or like whatever else they can like come up with. But, I think you have to, if you give too much information, then people just kind of can't access it. Right. So
visceral memories, or not visceral feelings, connect in a way that words just can't.
Yeah. We had a great conversation about this with Gwen and Nicole about like the tactile and how that sensory experience can just bring forward so many more memories and communicate so much more in the sort of hierarchy that language, like the written word, takes over everything else. And that
was something I definitely thought a lot about as I was like making embroidered work and having this really physical relationship with it, but then I was like presenting it digitally, or I was like printing it and like taking away that physical experience for a viewer. And really it was just like turning it into a different type of like digital texture. So like I was benefiting from the tactile nature, but maybe it was more of a like memory of the tactile nature to somebody who is seeing it there. So
sure. Yeah. That's a good point about changing those formats and like how that shifts things. Well, we're almost out of time. So I actually wanted to ask you, since you both are sort of most recently completed your degrees, like for any students that are out there wanting to know some advice, like what's some quick advice that you would give to anybody who's interested in going into a graduate program, or like, I don't know, just advice about being a freelancer, advice about sort of working in the studio or something like that?
Yeah, I would say don't go into grad school because someone tells you to, and to really understand where you're going. Just a sort of practical piece of advice that was shared with me and that I like to share with other people is that you shouldn't have to pay for grad school. I know funding packages, and this is like pretty basic nitty gritty, but like it was amazing advice for me. Find somewhere where you'll be valued and listened to, and where they, know your worth, and where you can connect with faculty, and make sure it really is just the right time. There's no rush to go all the way through like marathon sprinting. So really just sort of like soul search and make sure it's the right time and that it's right for you.
Yeah, I would totally echo that. I would say, actually, like, don't go immediately after undergrad. Like, take time in between, because what you want immediately out of school is going to change so fast. And so, I think having some life experience and taking some time to really know what you want next can really help to guide your research into grad schools. And that's another thing I would say is do a lot of research, like really get to know the faculty at the programs you're looking at. I know this might be harder now, but visit if you can. I know that for me, my decision was totally made based on like the feeling I got being there. And it was like the first gut feeling in a while that I was like, yep, that's it. And follow that thing. Like that was what helped me know that it was right. But also it wouldn't have been right at a different time for me. So yeah, I think timing is right. I think also knowing that like if you don't get accepted to a program, it might not be because you're not good enough. It might be because they don't have the resources to get you where you want to go. So knowing where you want to go and knowing what this program, that specific program can offer you, like they have to meet up in the right ways. So I think that's another really important thing to think about when you're looking.
Yeah.
Also, if you want to teach, make sure that the program you go to offers opportunities to be the instructor of record and not just a TA. Because that's really important later.
Crucial. It is crucial.
Yeah.
All really good things, both of you. Yeah. I see that things haven't changed that much then since I was there. So whatever that means. Anyway, thank you both so much for spending time with us this evening. Thank you to our viewers. If you have any other if you have any interest in revisiting any of our live stream events that happened through this exhibition, please visit our YouTube channel. Just search Anderson Gallery, Drake University, and you'll find all of our recorded live streams of various artists' conversations and artist lectures. All right. Good evening.
Thank so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.